I'm happy to be among the students, faculty, and friends of Elon University. When I was preparing to come here today, I read up on the latest news on Elon. You guys are crushing it in the U.S. News & World Report college rankings. Elon is the national leader in 8 academic programs focused on student success, number 2 in the nation for excellence in undergraduate teaching, number 11 in innovation. Elon is growing and thriving. You have set ambitious goals and you're achieving them. You should all be very proud. Your strategic vision emphasizes that Elon's purpose is to, quote, engage students' minds and inspire them to act as leaders and global citizens. Now, strategic visions are usually a lot of pretty words that end up saying very little. But these words have actual meaning. Elon backs them up with its commitment for students to study abroad. You are the first in the nation in the number of students studying in other countries. That's not just an accomplishment, it's a smart one. When you spend time abroad, especially in developing countries, you learn as much about your own country as the country you're visiting. For me, my experience as the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations was a tremendous source of perspective. My travel took me to places most Americans will never see. I sat across the table from representatives of the world's worst regimes. What I saw shaped me as a leader. It taught me things about America. It made most arguments on Twitter these days seem very small. In South Sudan, the government uses rape as a weapon of war. I sat with a sobbing woman who told me about soldiers ripping her baby from her arms and throwing him into a fire. She told me about being forced to eat the flesh of her own child. Hearing that gives you a new perspective and a new appreciation for the peacefulness of democracies. China is building a high-tech authoritarian state that literally tracks the movements of all of its citizens. And when you see China putting ethnic minorities into re-education camps, not allowing them to speak their language, practice their religion, or even give their children traditional names, when you see these things, you gain a new appreciation for freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and our right to safety and privacy in our own homes and workplaces. In Iran, women aren't allowed into stadiums to watch soccer games. One woman recently snuck into a match by dressing as a man. When she was caught, she faced 6 months in prison. So she set herself on fire in an act of protest. She died a couple of weeks ago. It makes you appreciate the progress we've made in protecting women's rights. America isn't perfect, I know that. I was born in the 1970s in Bamberg, South Carolina. I grew up a brown girl in a black and white world. My dad wore a turban and still does to this day. My mom wore a sari. We were outsiders. We stood out. My heart hurts when I think about the way people would look at my dad in his turban. After 9/11, he put an American flag sticker on his car like so many other Sikhs did, just to protect themselves. And we were exposed to an early, very ugly form of identity politics. For some reason, my mother entered my sister and I, then just 4 and 8 years old, into the We Miss Bamberg pageant. It was the thing you did if you had a little girl. Even then, in the late 1970s, the organizers crowned a black queen and a white queen. Needless to say, judging by our skin color, my sister and I were neither. The pageant organizers didn't know what to do with us, so they disqualified us and sent us home with consolation prizes. They thought in categories, and they didn't have a category for us. If you go around the world, you see people who are different, and you usually see that they're outsiders. What was different about America, what was different about Bamberg, South Carolina, is that our differences didn't have to define us. My mother and father had come to a country where no one, not the government, not our neighbors, could determine their worth and their place in society. That was up to them. My parents knew they could be more in America, so they worked hard, and our community came to accept us. Our country gave us the opportunity to strive and succeed. It gave my dad the opportunity to teach at a college. It gave my mom the opportunity to open a business. It gave me the opportunity to become governor and then UN ambassador. Growing up, my parents reminded my brothers, my sister, and me every day how blessed we were to live in this country. There isn't a day that goes by that I don't think of those words. The source of this blessing isn't where we live or even how rich we are as a nation. Our true wealth is in our values. The American principles of freedom and human dignity are the source of our national greatness. They are also our most powerful foreign policy tools. We can't and we shouldn't be the world's nanny or policeman, but we should act abroad in ways that honor our values. After spending 2 years battling with some of the world's most evil regimes, I'm more convinced than ever that American leadership is necessary for a more peaceful and just world. They don't like to admit it, but other countries feel the same way. Many countries never miss the opportunity to publicly run down the United States at the United Nations. But I can't tell you how many times representatives of these same countries said very different things in private. Time and again, they told me they welcomed U.S. leadership. They envy our ability to live and speak freely. They admire our principles, and they depend on us to lead the world in accordance with our values. Not long after I became ambassador, the Syrian dictator Assad launched chemical weapons attack on the Syrian civilians of a village called Khan Sheikhoun. Over 80 people died in the worst way imaginable, foaming at the mouth, vomiting, convulsing. 12 children literally suffocated to death in their own bodily fluids. In response, the United States conducted a missile strike against the air base from which Assad launched the attack. The next day at the UN, other ambassadors began to call and text me. Some took me aside in the Security Council. They weren't contacting me to protest the strike. They were contacting me to thank the United States for leading again. Acting abroad in defense of our values means acting in defense of human rights. For me, human rights have a natural central place in our foreign policy. They reflect what we believe as Americans. Unbelievably, the UN Security Council, the real source of power and influence at the UN, doesn't believe human rights is a subject worthy of its time. They believe that only peace and security deserve their attention. But take a look around the world. The reality is that human rights abuses are a leading cause of conflict, the kind of conflict that spills over borders and engulfs entire regions. The war in Syria has killed hundreds of thousands of people and created the largest refugee crisis of our time. But do you know how that war started? It began in 2011 with a group of teenage boys. They were hanging out and spray painted on a wall the message, "The people want the fall of their regime." The Syrian government reacted, arresting them. Then they were beaten, tortured, and had their fingernails pulled out. They were returned to their parents bloody and bruised. The government wanted people to see what they do to anyone who spoke out against the regime, even children. The parents were rightfully upset and protested. That sparked more protests by the people and more crackdowns by the government. The cycle repeated until there was a full-out war in Syria. The Arab Spring is another example. It was a series of uprisings across the Middle East and North Africa in 2010. It began with a simple street vendor in Tunisia. He had been harassed for years by the government while trying to sell his oranges, apples, and dates. One day, a corrupt police officer demanded he hand over his goods. When the vendor refused, the officer slapped him in full view of his fellow Tunisians. It was the last straw. He was so desperate to be heard, he set himself on fire in front of the offices of the police who had stolen from him. The street vendor's act of desperation set off protests and uprisings across the region. It led to the fall of the government of Egypt and brutal conflict in Libya, Yemen, Syria, and elsewhere. The Arab world was fundamentally altered, all because of a fruit vendor in Tunisia. It should make us all stop and think. There is a growing tendency in our politics to see people who don't think like we do as not just wrong, but evil. But I've seen true evil. Venezuela was once a thriving democracy. It was once the wealthiest country in South America. But thanks to the socialism, corruption, and brutality of the government, it is now one of the poorest and least free countries in South America. Venezuelans dig through trash cans and slaughter zoo animals to feed their people. The Maduro regime jails and tortures political dissidents by the thousands. I've watched Venezuelan families walk 3 hours in the blazing sun across the bridge to Colombia to get the only meal they might get that day. The average Venezuelan adult has lost 24 pounds. When you've seen that, it's hard to get emotional about what party someone belongs to or whether their speech is politically correct. The truth is, there are so many more things that we have in common than there are things that separate us. Our ability to speak freely, to debate, to worship, and to determine our own destinies, these are the things to be grateful for and to preserve, because they won't preserve themselves. That job will fall to you, the next generation of leaders. I'm optimistic about the future because I'm optimistic about your generation's ability to do the right thing, to be advocates for the rights we have, not by virtue of what country we were born in, but by virtue of our humanity. We must always strive to be a better people and a more perfect union. But in the end, there is one truth about our country, and I believe it with all of my heart. Even on our worst day, we are blessed to be in America. You are the leaders of our future. Congratulations. Never forget how blessed you are. Never stop extending those blessings to your fellow children of God. God bless you and thank you.